For this decorative stitch using crochet, I like to use a pearl cotton 8 weight. This one is from Valdani. The shade is 0544. It's a lovely variegated teal color. I have a pair of scissors, a couple of clips, a sturdy needle that I've already pre-threaded and knotted, and then a 4¼ millimeter hook, crochet hook. Before you start, I always start in one corner, and I like to use clips just to hold down my binding so I don't have to grip it so much with my left hand. So we'll apply a couple of clips here. So to start this crochet stitch, we're going to bury our knot in the seam that will get covered up by the seam binding. And you want to work out here on the edge and be aware of where that stitch line is, because we want to cover it up as best we can. You want to do a series of running stitches. This is a very basic stitch, and you want them to be somewhat even. I like to stay around 1/4 inch. You'll feel your needle hit or grab onto the quilt top that we're stitching. And you can go back and do hand stitching and stitch all that edge down if you want afterwards. So just a series of running stitches. You want to make sure that you grab the quilt top when you do it. So now that we're at our corner, we want to grab and go through all the layers and take a small little stitch, because this is how we're going to turn our corner. Just like that. And then continue around until you get to the end. I'm coming to the end of my thread, and so I'm just going to bury it under my seam binding. So I've taken a stitch and create a little knot. Make sure it's nice and secure. And then I just like to bury the tail so it'll stay put, and clip that off. Don't leave too much behind because you don't want it to stick out later. And I'll thread another needle. Now that I'm at my final corner, I want to kind of strategically place my stitches so they come out how where they end how I want them to. So that's going to be perfect. So I'll remove my clip. So you can see that I have just enough to then bring my needle down right there in that corner and come up underneath so that we won't see the knot. You try to have as crisp of a corner as you can, because when you come back to do the crochet, it will help with the way that that corner will look. And then I just bury the thread and cut it off. So there you have it. A running stitch is just a really nice basic beginner stitch, and it gives it an artisan quality, and it's lovely on its own. But if we want to elevate it, we can crochet it. Now it's time to start the crochet portion of this decorative stitch. I have folded over a length of my 8 weight pearl cotton, just not really creating a loop, but in order to attach to the hook. You want to slip your hook underneath one of your running stitches and draw that through underneath. You want to isolate out your tail, and you want to leave it long enough so that you can attach it at the end. I like to wrap the thread around my pinky and my forefinger. You want to start by grabbing your thread and pulling it through that first loop. So now we're attached to that first running stitch. We're going to do a chain stitch, and then we're going to go back underneath the running stitch again, pick up our thread and bring it through the loop, make another another chain stitch, and you're going to do 2, and you can see now we're at the base of the next running stitch. We're going to bring our crochet hook underneath that stitch and bring a loop through, and so now we're attached. We're going to do a chain stitch, go back underneath the running stitch again, that same running stitch, and bring our loop through, and you can see that we're starting to get this crocheted effect on those running stitches. I'll show you again. So 1, 2, and that got us to the base of the next running stitch. We're going to go underneath that stitch and pull a loop through, 1 chain stitch, and we're going to go again underneath the running stitch and pull a loop through, 1, 2, and we're at the base of the next running stitch. Go underneath, pick up your thread and bring it through the loop, a chain stitch, and back underneath the running stitch. And I'll continue down doing the same manner until I get to the end. When I get to the end, I'll show you how we turn the corner. Now that we've gotten to the end, it's time to turn the corner. So turn your work around, and you can see that I have a little bit of my running stitch poking through there. So I'm just going to go underneath that and start turning my corner. So now we're attached. We're going to do a couple of chain stitches and then go underneath that first running stitch and proceed in the same manner that we did before. Now, if you want to crisp up this corner after you're done doing your crocheting all the way around, you can come back through and just do a little tack there to hold it down so it's a little bit crisper. So now we have worked all the way around, and it's time to attach to our first loop. So I've worked all the way to the end. I've done like 3 chain stitches. We're going to go back underneath that first running stitch that we did and bring a loop up so that we can attach this section of chain stitching. And then at this point, what I do is I grab a hold of that tail that I left behind, and I bring it up through my last loop and draw it all the way through and tighten it down. And once you bury the threads, I like to tie a knot to get everything secured at the end. You really can't tell that where the attachment is. So we'll cut everything off. I've gone ahead and, just for time's sake, threaded 2 needles, and I just wiggle my way underneath that chain stitch, and I'm coming up here in the corner with one of the ends and going to pick up one of the stitches there, and you can see how I'm able to create a really nice crisp corner, and then work our needle underneath that binding so that we're able to bury the knot, and nobody will be able to tell that we tacked that down. And we'll bury our thread. And the same with this, we'll just bury our thread in the seam binding so that we can knot it and it won't be seen. It will all be invisible. So there you have it. And then you can go back and, like this one here needs a little tack, so we'll tack that down. The same as we did on the other corner. Oops. barrier a little knot there so no, you can't see it, and pick up just a few of those stitches, and there'll be enough give that you can just tack that down. So it crisped up that corner. And there you have it, a crocheted edge. It just creates a nice little bead, and you can see the beautiful ombre of the hand-dyed thread from Valdani. And so this actually works up pretty quickly. It seems a little bit tedious, but once you get on a roll, you can get through it very quickly. And I encourage you to give it a try. I think it's a really nice decorative addition to a binding, especially on an art quilt. And I've used it on several of my finished patterns that I've designed. So I hope you enjoyed this, and happy stitching. So in this demonstration, I'm going to show you a varied stitch on the seam binding. This is a very simple stitch, suitable for a beginner for sure. I have a threaded needle, and I have it knotted, and I have clipped off the end. I'm going to be using an 8-weight pearl cotton from Valdani. This is a hand-dyed thread, and the shade is P2. I have a sturdy needle here. I've applied my seam binding to the back of my piece, and I have quilted this also with a hand-dyed thread from Valdani, and it's a 35-weight thread, and the color is M47. And I just love the browns and the off-white and the greens, and I think it'll go really nicely with this contrasting thread. So you want to start by lining up your seam binding to cover up your stitch line from the application of that on the back, and bury your threads. You want to make sure that you grab onto the quilt top or the pillow that you're going to be stitching, and we're just going to be going back and forth. So I've come up through the seam binding, and now I'm going to come over to the quilt top, and it doesn't have to be precise, and just come alongside the seam or the stitch line there. And then I like to bring my thread over so that I can see that I have it even. If you get them kind of wonky, that's fine too. This is a hand stitch, so an artisan quality to your stitching is very suitable here. And I like to just hold my thread down, and we're creating a very varying stitch lengths, both across and the spacing. You do, when you come to where there is some quilting, you may find that it's a little bit difficult to get through those stitches, and then you want to check the back to make sure that you don't see your needle on the back, so that you don't see these stitches showing through. It's less likely that you're going to see the stitches showing through when you're on the binding, but when you're on the quilt top, you can definitely sometimes end up with your needle coming through the back. So you can see how I brought this thread over, so then I know exactly where maybe I'd like to put my needle. It may seem tedious, but I really enjoy this hand stitching, and I like that it gives a handmade effect to the seam binding. And you can see that that one's a little bit wonky, and that's okay. Embrace that. So I will continue around, moving my clips down as I progress. It just helps keep everything easier. I don't have to grip the seam binding as much. And when I get to the corner, I will show you how I turn the corner. Now that we're at a corner and we're approaching that corner, you kind of want to think about how your stitches are going to line up, because I like to end right in the corner. So you want to just kind of eyeball it, get a feel for how the stitches are going to land. So here we are in the corner. And then we'll end right there. And you can always go in and stitch these corners down more with an invisible stitch and a regular weight thread and tie off. And then wiggle your needle into that seam binding and bury your tail and cut off your thread. So you can see in this example how this P2 shade really blended well with the quilting done with the M47. And the stitches are kind of varied, very artisan quality, and very simple for a beginner. Or if your design just needs something simple, you just want to add a special touch to it. So I hope you enjoyed this and that this is something that you will try. Again, very simple, easy to do, and I think it just adds a little something special to a piece. Thank you for joining me, and happy stitching. For this demonstration, we're going to be doing a series of X's with a bar tack, and we're going to be using two different shades. P10, this is an 8-weight pearl cotton, and O522 8-weight pearl cotton. These go lovely together. The P10 also has a matching machine thread, and I use that for the quilting. So to start, I have a threaded needle, and I've got my trusty clips to hold down my seam binding that I have applied to the back, and we've turned it to the front. We're going to start by burying our threads in the seam binding so we won't see that. And you want to come up at an angle, and we're going to draw our thread diagonally across as though we're going to start making an X, and we're going to take our needle and bring it down and towards us, and just like that. You want to check to make sure that you haven't gone through the back, because that can happen. Now you're going to draw your thread across to create that X, and think about, imagine where you want to put your needle so that we're kind of lined up on that X. And now we're going to bring our thread up about the same distance as we did before, away from us, just like that. So we've created an X. And you can cinch that down. Now we're going to bring our thread back towards us diagonally, take our needle, and you can see how I'm fairly close to lined up with where the thread had come out on the previous stitch, just like that, and draw across and bring it down just next to where the other thread was. And you can see how I've brought the needle up next to that angled stitch and draw through. And we're just doing X's, but it's a really great look. I like it myself. So again, we're going to go across at an angle, bring our needle towards us and out next to the previous stitch, angle our thread across, and we want our needle to go into the binding across from the previous stitch, just like so. Super easy. Bring it up through, across from the previous stitch. We got our nice angle there. And then back up next to that first stitch to create another X. Then you can see the variation of this variegated thread start to really shine here. I'm going to go ahead and work down and around, and I will show you how we do a corner next. Now I'm going to show you how to turn the corner. You want to stop your X's right in here because you want it to line up with the other X's. So you want to think about how your stitches are going to lie. It can be a little bit tough in the corners because you've got some layers of fabric to go through. So I'm going to come up right there in the corner come across diagonally. And then I'm going to go over here to this X and come across, and I want to pick up the edge of that mitered corner so that we can get that stitch down. Just like so. So you can see it's so nice and tight. And when I bring this thread over, you can see that it just marries them all together really nicely. And I want to try to bury my thread so you can see how I'm going underneath where the binding will lie once I pull everything tight. Tie off. And then work your needle underneath the binding and bury your thread. So there we have turned the corner and we've finished our binding. You could leave it just like this. So now we're going to start our little accent bar that we're going to put across this X right here. I'm going to use the 0522 Valdani. This is just a really pretty overdyed pink magenta. It goes nicely with the variegated P10. So bury your thread in the seam binding like we've done before. And wiggle your knot under there so you can't see it. And now we're just going to take a series of running stitches and we're going to go in between the X's and just do a little accent bar. So over the top, go across that opening and come up next to the next X or cross over the stitches. And it just adds a little bit more interest. Little bead. So just like that, I'm going to continue around. So now we're at our corner and we're about to end these bar tacks for the X's. So I've come up here in the corner and I'm just going to continue like I was, going straight across. And then we're going to shift to the direction that this row is going. And end here. Now, in order to get my thread buried and be able to get my needle out and see what's going on, what I'll do is I'll put a pin there so that I can open up that binding a little bit. And you can see how my needle is underneath there. And this is so that I can bury my thread and for it not to be seen. So I just stick a little pin in there. I hope you can see that. And then remove it, remove the pin. And using my needle, kind of wiggle that knot underneath there. And then I just bury my threads in the seam binding, making sure that it didn't come out on the back. And it's all gone. Can't see anything. So that is your series of X's with a little bar tack, and that will work into the binding. We won't see it anymore. And I'm hoping that you will consider doing this decorative stitch on some of your quilt pieces. I particularly like this one because it gives me the opportunity to use a couple of different threads. So enjoy and happy stitching! For this sample, we're going to do kind of a decorative blanket stitch. Again, very beginner friendly, very easy. I have quilted this sample with P5, which is this variegated gold. It's a 3-ply, 35 weight. I have to say this is one of my new favorite threads, working with 3-ply, and I love this gold color. I've used it on several projects already. And then this magenta fuchsia color is 8-2, and this is a 35 weight, and this is a solid. So I thought they kind of went together nicely, and I had some really pretty variegated threads that I could do my big stitch seam binding with. I'm going to be using M12 and M27. These are both 8-weight pearl cotton. So we're going to start with the M27. We're going to bury our thread in the corner. And we're going to do a series of running stitches working around the piece using this thread. So you do want to try to space your threads evenly. I'm going to do about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to come back over the top of these stitches with a stitch going across like this. So you do want to leave maybe like a generous 1/4 of an inch from the edge of your piece. And as you stitch, be sure to grab a hold of your quilt top or your pillow top. And you want to make sure that you're covering up your stitches from this seam, stitching down the seam binding. When we come back around with this beautiful gold, we're going to be going in between these stitches. So try to make them as even as possible. But again, this is hand stitching and we want it to look hand stitched. So it doesn't need to be machine perfect. I'm going to work around my piece. And so now we're at our final corner. So I'll show you how to do the final corner. And you want to end with your stitch right here on that mitered corner if you can. So I'm going to go through all of the layers, and you can see I'm underneath that binding there so that I can bury my knot, snug everything up. Wiggle that knot underneath the binding. And bury your thread. So I have a needle already threaded with the M12, and so we want to come up next to that pink bar or running stitch, get our thread underneath there. And we're just going to start going in between. And so those open areas, we're going to fill in with the gold. So we want to go underneath that pink running stitch. Just like that. And go in between, fill in that opening. I think this is a fun way to use a couple of different colored threads. So I will continue around and we'll end right here and we'll bury our thread, and then we'll come back in and do a variation on a blanket stitch with the two different colors. Now that we've gotten to our final corner, I'm going to finish here and I'm going to wiggle my needle, since I have this gold thread on there already, over to this first pink running stitch. Just like so. And then we're going to come across these pink running stitches. So we're aiming for the center of that stitch. And we want to go over the top of that pink stitch and then go to the next pink stitch. And go over the top of that on, and this will help hold down our binding. So we'll go up to about the middle of that pink running stitch and come across it and up to the next one. Just like so. I'm going to work around to the end and then we'll do the same with the pink. So you can see here that I have gone ahead and done this like faux blanket stitch in between the pink running stitches with the gold. And I'm coming to the end. And so I'm going to pull back And just take a little stitch underneath the binding to create one last bar and tie off. And bury our thread. And now we'll start with our M27, which is a variegated pink and purple. And we're going to do the opposite. We're going to do it on the pale yellow or the gold as it transitions into gold. So bury our... I apologize, it's pollen season here. We have puddles of pollen outside. In the afternoons, the wind kicks up. So you can see we haven't gone through the back. So just creating our little faux blanket stitch, and we're aiming for the middle of the yellow, opposite of what we did with the prior thread color. Go over the top of that bar, just like so. I'm going to work around and I'll show you how I finish. So now I've gotten to the end of doing my M27 little bar tack blanket, faux blanket stitch. So we'll end here. I'm going to take a little stitch to try to get that knot buried. And we will be done with this sample. I feel like this decorative stitch almost makes it seem as though you've applied a trim, another trim to it. The variation and variegation of the threads really has a strong presence in the way that the gold turned to white eventually, and the pink turned to this really pretty purple color. So I'm hoping that you will try this stitch. It's it's a series of very simple stitches going around, but it has a great effect. So I hope you'll give it a try. Thank you for watching, and happy stitching. So I'm using a top stitch needle, and this is a 100 by 16, and you'll see how big that hole is there, and that gives us the opportunity to use this 15 weight wool in our sewing machine. So I like to give this thread a nice good twist before I try to thread it. It will go through the needle lovely, but it can be a little bit tricky to get it started just because the thread has a little bit of loft. But don't despair, because it really does work. I'm using a pair of sharp tweezers here, and you can see that I have the ends twisted really nicely. And it goes right in. And now you're ready to stitch. I'm using a Bernina 790 to pre-stitch my seam binding with this 2-ply Australian virgin wool thread. It's a 15 weight. I did not need to do any special adjustments to my machine. However, I did choose to lengthen my stitch length. It will stitch out in the normal stitch length, which is a 2.5, but I've taken it all the way up to a 6.0, and it looks lovely. So do a sample before you actually stitch on your seam binding and see that you like it before you actually do the stitching on your binding. That would be my recommendation. So I started out with a 3-inch wide seam binding strip that I folded in half, so now we're at 1.5, and ultimately we'll have a 1/2-inch seam binding when we attach it to, this will be for a sample, but this, if you were using this type of binding for your quilt top. I have the folded edge lined up with the edge of my foot, and you are just going to be surprised at how easily this sews. I was really surprised how easily this worked out. And I've gone through several layers with this, but you have to remember that this is a decorative thread, and so you want to be gentle. You don't want to be super, super fast about it. I'm just going to go ahead and cut my thread. So you can see how lovely that looks. And on my sample, I did 2 rows, and so we'll do that. And you could vary the stitch length, but I just think it's a really nice look and something a little different for your binding. So there you have it. Next, I'll show you how I stitch this down onto the sample. So now that we've attached our pre-stitched seam binding to, in your case, it may be a quilt. This is just a sample that I'm using to demonstrate. We want to take these threads and thread a needle and find the hole that is going to make this look seamless and bring those 2 threads through, the top and the bottom thread. And so we'll finish it off with invisible stitching like you would on a normal quilt. We're not going to do anything decorative, but you can see that they line up pretty well. And we'll just make a knot on the back, like so, and cut off our tail. And then I have a pre-threaded needle here with just normal sewing thread. We'll push those tails to the side. We want this to go underneath so we don't really see that little corner poking out, which is easy enough to do. So we'll bury our thread, and I'm going to be working on this top part of this seam binding so that it will cover the piece that's below it so we don't see it. I use my needle to poke that in under. Grab a hold of the quilt top on the other side of the stitch line from the binding and grab the corner of the top seam binding there because we want to get that buried under there. Take a little running stitch on our top. Running stitch on the binding, just like so. And tuck that little bit of thread in there so we don't see it. And we'll continue to go around and do invisible stitching just like you would on any quilt top. So now that I have all my invisible stitching done, you can see how lovely this turns out. And it's a nice decorative touch to your seam binding where you can use your machine. And I was thrilled with the way that this 15 weight 2-ply Australian virgin wool thread worked out from Valdani. And this color was perfect for this quilting. So I hope you give it a try. You have to play around with the settings on your machine. My settings might not be the same as yours, but I'm hoping that the tips that I gave you earlier will help you be able to set up your machine so that you can use a decorative thread. So I hope you enjoyed this and that you'll give it a try. And happy stitching!